So today we'll talk about Enlightened Absolutism, which is a real result of the Enlightenment thoughts being applied to practical political situations and the absolute monarchs of Europe continuing to maintain their power and continuing to oppress their people, but in a way that really isn't as terrible as it had been before or could have been. So we'll look a little bit at what Enlightened Absolutism really is, and then we'll look at 4 case studies, because there's really 4 main figures in this era. So first, we have this idea of Enlightenment and Absolutism, and they don't really go together, because these Enlightenment thinkers are calling for political reform. They're calling for changes in the way things are, more equality, more justice, more fairness, more laws, more protection for citizens. And that's coming all over the place. Beccaria, Montesquieu, Locke, all of these different people are calling for political reform. But absolutist rulers don't want to give up their power, and they really have power in pretty much every country in Europe, with the exceptions of England, the Netherlands, and Poland-Lithuania, which very quickly finds itself in a bad spot. So these two ideas are not compatible at all. And that creates kind of this tension between the intellectuals and the politicians that plays out through the end of 18th century Europe. And all of this changes when these people begin to get ideas. And these ideas are what we call Enlightened Absolutism. That is, that we will keep this absolutist form of government, but the monarchs who are leading it will be educated and enlightened, and they'll be more concerned with the good of the people. They'll be more concerned with these political reforms that the Enlightenment thinkers had called for. So we educate the top, and then that will increase the quality of life kind of for everybody. So they would have, in theory, these just and fair laws rather than arbitrary injustice. And this in turn leads to human happiness all around and improvements for everybody. So this idea is that this change needs to happen from the top down rather than the bottom up. And this stems in part from the philosophers' view that humans really just kind of suck. There's this real genuine distrust of people and their ability to do anything right. And so the philosophers of this time kind of tend to believe that humans are useless, immoral beings, and they can't be trusted to make their own decisions. And so they need these absolute monarchs to guide them. And these absolute monarchs were kind of from a higher status and therefore would make better decisions. So this distrust of the general population led the philosophers to put their trust in absolute monarchs. Now there's also practical purpose to this as well. Most of these people are French. They're operating in an absolute monarchy. So if they came out saying absolute monarchy is the worst way to go, they would most likely find themselves in jail or with their head cut off, as a number of them actually do find themselves jailed for a time. So they kind of have to appease their absolute monarchs, but this is their way of beginning to get reforms, thinking if we can get our absolute monarch to start to think about changing, we'll be in better shape. So that's kind of the idea behind Enlightened Absolutism and what it is, and it's kind of a confusing concept. It doesn't really seem to go hand in hand, but it works out in 18th century Europe. So the first area we'll look where this enlightened monarchy takes root is in Prussia. And all of these people that we will look at earn great favor from these philosophers and really communicate a lot with them. So the first person we'll look at is Frederick the Great. He is in Prussia, reigns from 1740 to 1786. He has a rough young life, abused by his father, not treated very well. There's indication that he is homosexual, and his father, so he's homosexual, very into arts and culture and music and being enlightened. And his father is very militaristic and not into this. And so Frederick and his father often have tension. Frederick tries to run away with his young lover / best friend. They're captured, and his father has them both arrested and then makes Frederick watch as his boyfriend's head is cut off in front of him. And so you can imagine that he's slightly jaded, doesn't really have any love for his father, and just kind of ruins him for the rest of his life. But he ends up reigning and doing some really great things. So the first thing he does, he does follow in the model of his father in terms of expansion and military. And so he gains the trust of Austria. And he says basically, hey, let me help you guard this area called Silesia. And I'll just, have my army there to guard it. And he does. And when Charles, the Emperor of Austria, passes away, Frederick says, that pragmatic sanction thing he signed, well, I'm not going to believe that, because there's this old Silesian law that says a woman can't inherit the throne. And it's about a 200-year-old law. But because of that, we can't have your daughter, Maria Theresa, become the ruler here. So this land has to belong to Prussia. So he backstabs Austria and gains Silesia from them. Domestically, he makes some pretty significant economic reforms. He allows some religious tolerance we begin in this era to see the era of religious tolerance. Before that, it didn't happen. But he's showing religious tolerance and even some freedom of the press, which is really impressive because there's some critical things written about him. Although, again, I urge you to remember that this is all really minor incremental change. It's not freedom of the press that grants total freedom. Revises the legal system and creates the first Germanic code of law, for the first time, really codified law across all of Germany. So those are his main areas of reform, and that's what makes him enlightened, is that he's taken these ideas from the philosophers of the time and applying them to a country, allowing tolerance, allowing people to speak their mind, and giving them rights, and then defining what those rights are in law. And that had never been done before. Before this, in absolutism, it's just whatever the king or queen felt like that day. So Frederick the Great really exemplifies this enlightened ruler, and he's in Prussia. In Austria, we have a few Habsburgs that are going to go, a mother and a son. The first is Maria Theresa. When she comes to power, she has to fight this war of Austrian succession, and that's the one where Frederick takes this land from Austria. She finds herself fighting to claim the throne and hold on to it, despite what the pragmatic sanction had said. So she does a few things. First, she centralizes power. She manages to get rid of those pesky Hungarians, and she centralizes power in Austria. She reforms serfdom slightly, makes it a little bit better for the working class people, but not great, but it's better. She reforms the method of tax collection in order to be more efficient and more fair. And then the last thing she does is she really curtails the power of the Catholic Church to keep the Pope out. So we see the crumbling of the old hierarchy where the church was supreme to everybody. Now we see these monarchs educated in the new philosophies beginning to push out the power of the church and push back and take sole power for themselves. This again fits in with this idea of absolutism. Eventually, as we see in 1780, Maria Theresa dies and she's succeeded by her son, Joseph II. He has a short 10-year reign, but he really does some incredible things. He continues the reforms of his mother, continues to control the Catholic Church in major ways, and in a remarkable turn, grants religious tolerance not only to Protestants, but to Jews as well. And you recall that the Jews had been kicked out of Spain before. We're about to come upon a time where they're persecuted pretty heavily in France. They had been persecuted throughout Eastern Europe before this. So the fact that Joseph allows them to come into Austria is pretty impressive. He abolishes serfdom in 1781, and that's kind of a good move, but he takes it a little too far when he says, okay, now you can't pay the serfs, or now peasants, I guess, in goods. You have to pay them in money. And so nobles now had to pay their workers in cash. And this backfires completely because the economy simply isn't set up to be dealt with money. It's designed to be a barter economy. So the nobles hate it because they have to find this cash and give it out. And the peasants hate it because they get this cash and they don't know what to do with it. So that whole idea of paying serfs money instead of in goods really backfires on Joseph. That is his most radical reform. And it's also the one that backfires the most on him. Eventually that is overturned after Joseph has passed away. So those are the changes in Austria. We'll look now further east to Russia, and we'll look at a really interesting woman in Catherine the Great. And if you follow the line of Catherine the Great, she's actually a German princess. who ends up marrying into, she has some small claim back to the Russian throne, but she ends up marrying into the Russian royal family. She's brilliant, she's smart, she's educated, she's interested in learning. Her husband's an idiot, he's ugly, he's not interested in governing, and he's basically a useless slob. And so she just very simply arranges to get rid of him. She has her lover, who's very powerful within the army, to stage this little military coup and to have her husband executed. And upon that death, she then claims the throne of Russia for herself. So really a brutal way to gain power, but an efficient way to gain power. And by doing so, she helps to really bring Russia into a more modern era. So she really, you can look at her as, although she's a little ways after Peter the Great, she really kind of continues in that tradition, with her first main goal being to westernize Russia, to bring in Western architects and writers and artists and professors and scientists. She really wants Russia to be Western, and so she imports a lot of these workers. Again, this should sound like what Peter the Great did, because it's very similar. On a domestic front, she makes some serious reforms to laws and creates a law system that's codified throughout the Russian Empire. She increases education for everybody and restructures what that's going to look like, and then takes away some of the power from the old nobles and really reforms local government to give more power down to the people. So that's her domestic kind of policy. And then, like all good rulers at the time, she really looks to expand the empire. And together with Prussia and Austria, they split up Poland, Lithuania, which was a commonwealth, very weak, where they had to elect a king, actually. Kind of an odd republic democratic system where they would elect a king. But they're never able to, in Poland and Lithuania, they can't make a decision without unanimous consent of the nobles. So basically decisions are never made. And that leaves them primed to be picked apart by the three great empires surrounding them, which also happen to be the three great Enlightenment rulers that we talked about, these Enlightened Absolutists, Catherine, Maria Theresa, and Frederick the Great. And those three countries end up dividing up Poland. So what we see with these four rulers is really people who take absolutism and subscribe to that theory that they should have absolute power. But they also like these Enlightenment ideas of justice, law, and some minor reforms that lead to progress on the human front. So these are people who you could consider reformers and absolutist, which seems to be an oxymoron, but in this case really fits well together.